For now, let's bring in our international affairs editor, Armin Georgian. Armin, thank you for joining us. Are we in any way surprised by these results?
No, I mean, the opinion polls showed that the vote would go against independence. That was pretty clear. But with these referendums, Sanam, there's always an issue about who's eligible to vote. So in the previous referendum on independence in 1987, there was a general boycott by Kanak political organizations. That's the essentially indigenous population of New Caledonia, because they said the terms of voter eligibility was unfair. And so Kanaks essentially stayed away from the polls in that previous independence referendum, and that's why the vote against independence was so high in 1987. This time it's lower because, of course, indigenous people did participate in this vote. In fact, you could even argue that this time round the terms of eligibility were kind of a lot more favorable to Kanaks, in the sense that this time round there was a group of people that was excluded from voting. That's people who'd come to New Caledonia in the last 20 years. And our own correspondent, Jack Hughes, he tweeted that this time round many white European migrants were excluded, those white European migrants having a weak connection to this territory. So you would have expected those people, had they been able to vote for staying in France. So that 58% for staying in France could have actually been much higher. But anyway, that was the terms of the vote.
Now, you just mentioned, Armin, the last referendum for independence, which was in 1987, almost 3 decades ago. And at the time, 98% voted to stay with France. What has changed? Because obviously it's considerably lower this time around.
Yeah, well, a lot has changed. I mean, the turning point really after 1987 was the Ouvert tragedy of 1988 that resulted in the deaths of 19 Kanak activists and 2 French soldiers, and that tragedy paved the way for the political accords of 1988 and 1998, and it was actually the 98 Nouméa Accord that led the way to this referendum, which has just been held now. And in fact, it's not the end of the whole story, because under that same Nouméa Accord, they can still have 2 more referendums on this very same issue in 2020 and 2022. So this is definitely not the end of the matter, Sanam. But what's also happened in that time, these last 30 years, is the devolution process. So even before we talk about today's referendum, you had a transfer of power from Paris to New Caledonia. So that's why New Caledonia already has special status, because it has its own powers in taxation, health and education, for example. These are not powers that other French territories necessarily have in the Pacific and elsewhere. So the question this time round was, do you want full sovereignty? That's to say, the so-called kingly powers, foreign affairs, defense, security, and the choice of your own currency, if you want. So the New Caledonian voters have said no to those things for now. As I said, they can still probably vote on them in the future because of the other 2 referendums. Socially, things have changed as well. Analysts have said that in the last 20 years, these gaps have narrowed between the European descended population and the indigenous population, but you still see the gap in educational attainment, in things like pay for jobs and so forth. There is still a gap between the Kanaks and the Caldoches, as they're called, and also a north-south divide, which we can see very clearly in the results today, Sanam, because although the south, for example, Nouméa, the de facto capital, I think the yes was something like 19% according to the current results. But if you go to the towns in the north, you have a complete reversal. So you have in the 70s, 80s, or 90% in favor of independence. So a big divide. So perhaps not an end to those divisions which Macron sort of trumpeted in his speech just now.
Armin Georgian, thank you very much for that analysis, saying that despite these results, this may not be the last that we hear about independence in New Caledonia. Now, France